Thank you for inviting me to be with you today. It's great to be with you here. I think I'm here to give you the politician's view, the politician's angle. I was the Minister for the Cabinet Office between 2010 and 2015. It was a cabinet level posting in David Cameron's coalition government. When we started in 2010, Britain had some really serious problems. We had the biggest, don't want to boast, but we had the biggest budget deficit in the developed world. We were infamous for the most expensive government IT in the world, with a dreadful record of failed projects. And I led a program of radical government reform, which over 5 years cumulatively saved $75 billion, roughly, from efficiency savings. We downsized the civil service by over 20%. We reformed public sector pensions. We got out of real estate we didn't need. We reformed government procurement to try to end the monopoly rule of what I came to know as the procurocrats. Some of you may have come across these so-called professionals for whom process is always king, and rigid adherence to process will always trump a sensible outcome. We reformed how we managed and led major projects. We cut our overrun rate from 2 out of 3 to only 1 out of 3. It's actually not bad. That bears reasonable comparison with a lot of the private sector. We created a mutualization program that freed the entrepreneurial spirit, which too often gets ignored in government. In the public sector, there are many more people who are natural entrepreneurs than is ever recognized, and the key is to find them and liberate their entrepreneurial spirit. Too often, the entrepreneurial spirit is used to find ways around the bureaucratic constraints on their action. We found some ways, not enough, of liberating them. And by the end of that 5 years, Britain was ranked top in the world for digital government and top in the world for open government based on our parallel program of open data and transparency. Well, how do we do it? Well, it doesn't happen spontaneously. I'm sorry, that's the bad news. This is not a kind of instantaneous process. Early on in our time, I asked the then Prime Minister of Estonia how it was that his tiny country had become the world leader for e-government. Easy, he said. When we became an independent country in the early 1990s, he said we had 2 advantages. We had no legacy, because the Russians had cleaned the place out when they left, and we had no money, so we had to do things very differently. Well, I replied, we've created the second of those 2 conditions. We've got no money. But we've sure as hell got shed loads of legacy. The first priority for us was to stop the madness, to stop the self-harm. And within days of taking office, I put in place some central controls so that no one anywhere in Britain's national government could embark on a contract, an IT contract, for more than £1 million without me personally signing it off. Grudgingly, after a time, because even I realized that that might have been a bit anal, we raised it to 5 million, but I exercised that control personally for the whole 5 years I was in that post. And that really upset people across government. They assumed that politicians have the attention span of a gnat, and pretty soon Francis would get bored with this, and they could go back to normal doing things whatever way they chose. Well, I obviously didn't have enough going on in my life because we carried on doing it. And of course, in the early stages, all we could do was say no, to stop people doing the wrong thing. But we needed to do better than that, so we hired some fantastic people to set up GDS. You've just heard from one of them, Tom, Mike Bracken. These were the heroes who got us to the top of those world rankings and did immeasurable good for the citizens of Britain. But don't expect the people in the top of government organizations to enthuse about any of this. I'll give you what I think are a few lessons from what we did. First, those central controls are absolutely essential. Of course, it's great. People are always saying, well, look, you need to get buy-in from around the system. Yeah, that's great. Buy-in's lovely. But actually, you can spend all of your energy and time seeking in vain to get buy-in from people who feel threatened by what you're introducing. At the end of it, you need top cover from the most senior people in government. You need confident and competent people who can do difficult stuff and get it done, and who can inspire others around the system. But don't expect people at the top of government organizations to enthuse. Many will see digital as a threat. It's a threat to their empires. And in too much of government, too often, power and status gets measured by the size of your budget and the size of your headcount. We know what happens when empires feel threatened. The empire strikes back. And governments have typically expected the public, the users of services, the public and businesses who interact with them, to adapt themselves to the way in which government happens by historical accident to be configured, instead of actually doing what of course we should do, which is to adapt ourselves, configure ourselves in relation to how people themselves and business themselves operate and are configured. People thought initially that what we were doing was all about technology. It was just about some fancy stuff produced by some weird hippie types who Francis had brought into Whitehall. It wasn't. It was about completely redesigning the way in which government works. GDS had this mantra, which they rightly never stopped using, which is, it's all about user needs. And that's, I still get actually, more than a year now after I stopped doing that job, I still get people occasionally coming up to me and saying, Francis, I did whatever such and such a transaction online. I could not believe how easy it was. People's expectations about how they expect to interact with government are very low. Much lower than, and in a world where they expect to be able to do most things in their life conveniently, quickly, cheaply, online, they struggle with why government can't adapt to that. So as a politician, of course, this ought to be fantastic news, because who are the users? Oh, wait, they happen to be voters as well. So don't assume politicians won't be interested in this. They need to be engaged in the right way. Engage them, show them how digital can bring them political wins. Yes, as you do this, as you go along this path, expect to accumulate some scar tissue. We've all got plenty of that. Don't assume that everything you're told as you do all of this is true. Some of it won't be, and that's kind of wearing, emotionally wearing, when you find you have to check so much of what you're told to find out whether it's true. Don't agonize forever about perfect policy design. Iterate policy, as Tom was saying. That process with universal credit was incredibly illuminating for all of us. Iterate in the way that you would iterate the technology. I just concluded at the end of my approach to government, I belong to the what I call the JFDI school of government. Just do it. GDS had a much more sophisticated version, which was strategy is delivery, but that's much higher level than I could aspire to. In Britain, there's a class divide in the public service, in the civil service, between the white-collar, the Mandarin types who do policy, and so what they like to do is write things down and produce those thick documents that Tom showed in his slide. And then there are the blue-collar people who are a bit below the salt, who actually do stuff, who may be commercial or financial or tech, digital people, or actually running serious operations in government. And what you find in Britain is they never get the top jobs. There's hard hands to do the detail work, but actually it's the Mandarins who get the top jobs. And there is a different way of doing it. There's a process of a way of doing open policy making where you engage with stakeholders. We did this when we were developing policy on data sharing, incredibly sensitive, lots of civil liberty issues involved, and we simply said we're going to get all of the pressure groups in, all of the expert groups in, we're going to develop this policy with them, very openly, so to build some trust between them. And it takes people in government time to get used to this. The first session I went to, I found that the room was organized a bit like this, actually, theater style, with a stage where we were going to tell these stakeholders how it was going to be. And I said, that's not quite how collaboration works, guys. We need to do this a bit differently in future. So those signals are absolutely key. So look, sometimes, final thought here, sometimes you will think you're going mad. And we all, when you're doing the kind of stuff that we all do, have done, continue to do, it's always disruptive. What we do in government is the only place I find now where disruption is still a bad word. What we do is fundamentally disruptive, and you often wonder whether it's you that's mad or whether the person you're talking to is. I just want to give you some reassurance. You're not mad. You're the sane, rational ones, and don't give up. Best of luck to you all. Great pleasure to be with you. Thank you very much.